Hi everyone, and welcome back to part 5 of today's lecture series on art in daily life and death. And for this part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about another common context in which we often see plebeian style art, and that is commercial decoration, so the decoration of shops. So the first example that I want to show you of commercial decoration picks up where we left off with the lararium. And this is a lararium from a shop context in Pompeii from the Thermopolium of Vitutius Placidus. And here you can see the counter space right off the road where the hot food vessels would be kept. And then right to the edge of the counter, this beautiful little lararium painting. I love this painting because first we have our Genius at the center here. We have our serpents down below approaching the altar with their knotted snaky bodies. And then what we have are our two Lares. And then finally we have Mercury here, represented identifiable by his money bag and his caduceus, his special little staff that he carries always. And Mercury is the god of commerce. And then over on this other side, we have once again Bacchus. And if you think back on our Vesuvian Lararium painting, once again we have that little panther, and Bacchus pouring out wine to his companion panther. So he is also recognizable, and that of course is our god of wine. So we have a sort of god of commerce, a god of drinking here in this restaurant space. So a little bit of a personalization of the Lararium to the format of a commercial zone. So that's just our first example. Now, if we move away a little bit from both Pompeii geographically and from this sort of household religious representational sphere, we can go look at some shop signs from Ostia. Here we go. So our first here is a sign from a greengrocer, and it seems to be from about 200 CE, so a little bit later, about a century later actually, than anything that we see in Pompeii. And here we have in Ostia a lot of these marble street signs that in some way represent the commerce that would go on in the associated shop. So in this case, we have our greengrocer here gesturing to the wares out on the counter. We have a way of showing the produce that is on sale that kind of recalls almost the Egyptian offering tables that we looked at a long time ago, where we have mixed perspective to show different views to really highlight what kinds of produce is available here. We have these long-stemmed onions, it looks like. And we also have an interest in showing different parts of the sort of process of the commercial activity going on here. So we have the produce that is for sale, we have the sort of bundling, the cloth that would be used to tie produce into bundles here, we have a basket down below. So the various sorts of equipment necessary for the business are on display in addition to the wares, with highlighting the sort of the greengrocer's friendliness and availability as a person who can show you and share with you this produce. So this is our first example to look at another shop sign from Ostia. Move my head somewhere else. To look at another shop sign from Ostia here, we see a shop sign from a poulterer, so someone selling bird meat. It looks like among other things in this case. And here we have some customers. We have a little bit of scale difference, right, to show that the person selling is a little bit larger than their tiny little customer here. And that gives the artist the space to also show the wares up above hanging from this little gibbet. Then we have all sorts of little details of other animals. These look like monkeys up here. And then we have some rabbits down in the corner. So sort of this variety, maybe even a little hint of the exotic, being available at this place. So this sign is a little bit more complicated, right? We have a lot more figures, we have greater variety in the objects that are shown being sold. Um, and then we have, again, this sort of stocky build for our figures, more emphasis on the heads and the hands than on the sort of musculature of the bodies, and the proportions are squished a little bit so that they actually take up a little bit less space in the composition than they would if they were sort of pulled out like taffy. One of the things that I think is really interesting about plebeian art is this dedication towards showing narrative quality, right? Like being emphatic about what you're seeing, simplifying shapes so that they are more legible. That is balanced with an understanding of the visual idiom, right? So these round objects that are being sold here are really difficult for me as a viewer to parse out, but the simplification of the design is there to sort of emphasize the object being sold. So there's an idea that to understand plebeian art, you kind of have to be on this in crowd. You have to understand the visual idiom that they are working within, and be able to sort of decode more highly abstracted images than you do when you look at a piece of very naturalistic classicizing art, right? There's a little bit less decoding to be done on the part of the viewer. You don't need necessarily to know as much information to see fancy musculature as you do to sort of parse out what on earth is being sold hung up here. And what is this man holding, right? So there's an interesting sort of balance that happens where you actually have a more complicated visual language as the actual structure of the image becomes simplified. So moving into our last example of these shop signs over here, here we have another example from the 2nd century CE, and in this case we have a wine trader of sorts. We have the delivery of amphora by one figure to another, and then the stacked vessels behind. Again, just this sort of a little bit of a hierarchy of scale in terms of actually blowing up the vessels themselves so that they are extra easy to see and highlighted. We have pretty sort of chunky drapery here. Not a whole lot of emphasis on the bodies of the figures being shown. There's rather large-headed patron here as well. So again, we have this sort of shop sign mentality where you want to show off your wares in as clear a way as possible, communicating as much information as you can through as elegant a means as you possibly can. Marble shop signs are not the only way that we see art being integrated into the commercial sphere. If we go back to Pompeii, to our Street of Abundance, Via dell'Abbondanza, we have a lot of facade paintings as well. So not just decoration within the shop itself, but also paintings on the outside of the building so that passersby would see them. In this case, we have a reconstruction of a set of shops in Pompeii, and I want to focus a little bit more on the one that is here on the left in this picture, the Tavern of the Four Gods. Here's a picture of what it looks like now, with some of the paintings missing from it. And you can see we have the heads of 4 gods up above the sort of main doorway. The space behind is unexcavated as of yet. And then to either side of the door, we have other images that I have here. On the left, an image of Venus Pompeiana, the patron goddess of the city of Pompeii. She shows up a lot. And then on the right, we have what appears to be a small painting, or at least the figures are of a much smaller size than they are on the Venus Pompeiana side, of a procession in honor of a goddess called Cybele, so an imported goddess from the East. If we take a little bit of a closer look at the 4 gods on top, on the far left, we have here Apollo, recognizable by the rays of the sun behind his head. We have Jupiter, Zeus, our Zeus analog, who is recognizable by his kingly scepter and his beard, of course, and his diadem. We have Mercury, again, that god of commerce. He is recognizable by his caduceus, his special staff, and his winged hat in this case. And then finally, we have Diana or Luna, the goddess of either the hunt, if it's Diana, or the moon. Both of those goddesses have an association with the moon, which here we see framing this woman behind her head. So a really interesting mix of gods and goddesses that draws both on sort of local traditions, Venus Pompeiana, the most local goddess we've got, large-scale state religious traditions that are commonly held, like Mercury in the commercial realm or Jupiter as the king of the gods everywhere. And then we have the sort of Eastern goddess, Cybele, the introduction of a mystery cult, an interest in the sort of role of religion and thinking about the afterlife and death and rebirth as well, all in one shop. So every passerby on the street kind of sees these visual signals and can start to work them together into an interpretation. So if we talked about the sort of associative interpretations that come out of looking at a Roman house, when we have multiple panels of paintings in a Roman shop, it may take on yet another set of interesting associative connotations as well. So why these gods? Why this place? What is the proprietor trying to tell us as we're crossing by on the street around here? To look at another example of a shop facade from the same street in Pompeii. Here we have a cloth maker, a felt maker's shop, and we know this because we have the painted sign, that here. So here's the facade painting from the shop of M. Vicilius Secundus, and he's a cloth maker. Once again, we have our Venus Pompeiana figure. She is wearing a city crown, a crown in the shape of a city. She has her Eros with her so that we know that she is both Venus and a goddess associated with the town of Pompeii in this case. And here she's being drawn in a chariot by 4 elephants, accompanied perhaps by Agenius here, over here, with the cornucopia and the toga drawn over the head. So we have a sort of another religious painting, one that signifies dedication to the goddess of the place of Pompeii, civic pride. And then below that, we have this little strip that shows us some pieces of the process of cloth making. So we have here felt makers working in a workshop, treating the fabric, and then we have the finished cloth at the end, which is painted with little purple borders, so it's a fancy cloth in this case, being held up proudly at the end of the process. So we have, again, this sort of interesting dedication to showing the narrative progression of what goes on in this commercial space, not just the final wares, but also the processes that are behind them. It's a really interesting sort of way of conceptualizing work as a narrative worth showing in an artistic medium. And having that on the outside of your shop as a sort of advertisement is a really interesting way of thinking about why you would want to show work to passersby. So what I want you to do now, as I move my body around here again, my figurative zooming webcam body, I want you to think a little bit actually more about these characteristics of plebeian style and their role in an ancient commercial context, and to sort of respond to the question, just in a sentence or two, of why you think, what you think the plebeian style characteristics of art can accomplish in commercial space that classicizing art might not be able to accomplish in commercial space. That's that, and I am looking forward to seeing you in the next lecture.